Hello, and welcome back to Module 4 in our Graphic Medicine lecture series. I'm Dr. Rachel Thomas. In our last module, we talked about literary theory, and then started with the bare bones of things to think about for your comic, in addition to basic anatomy. Today we're going to focus on materials, techniques, and further development of your 4-panel comic. I'd like to acknowledge that funding for this set of modules comes from the HEAL Healthcare Project via the National Collaborating Center for Indigenous Health. The Hearts-Based Education and Anti-Colonial Learning Project, or HEAL, is funded in part by Indigenous Services Canada. As much of this research and creation was conducted on Quebecois soil, I would like to take the time to recognize that I acknowledge that my work in Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, takes place on the unceded Indigenous lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka, or Mohawk Nation. When you get started, you might want to consider what materials you plan on using, whether they're traditional or digital media. Digital drawing requires a program like Photoshop or Illustrator from Adobe, Clip Studio, or Procreate. Some tablets like Wacom sometimes include their own software that can be downloaded alongside the tablet driver. Whether you use traditional or digital media is a preference. Drawing software was meant to streamline the drawing process, making sometimes tricky and non-fixable mistakes easy to rework or erase. Some artists, however, really enjoy using traditional media and will develop all of their works using mixed media, either dry or wet, then scan and rework on a drawing software for further distribution. You've been provided a workbook, so hopefully you're able to either pull it into one of these softwares to do digital drawing, or you're able to print it off and draw it yourself. When it comes to tools, obviously we have the digital, but having an assortment of some really straightforward, inexpensive dry and wet media is good too. Starting with the absolute basics is our paper. Getting yourself a sketch pad is always nice to have, but even inexpensive printer paper is nice to work with, especially when you're just sketching out ideas. Cardstock is thicker than printer paper, and you can also get better quality papers for your final comics. Now, I'm going to be focusing on traditional media for the moment, but you can use nicer cardstock if you're scanning and then printing your final comics. Cold press paper is also known as rough finish Bristol paper, kid, or vellum, and has a textured surface. You can get some really interesting fuzzy lines and can cause inking pens to spatter ink in a more interesting way with cold press paper. Hot press paper, smooth finish Bristol paper, or plate, is smooth and can cause ink to dry more slowly and can also cause issues with unwanted or wanted ink smears. You can also get inexpensive Bristol boards from the dollar store if you're just starting out and cut them down. Or if you want to splurge a little bit, going to an art supply store and picking out a paper you like is a good idea. I like Fabriano or Arches, especially if you're playing around with watercolors or gouache. We then have pencils. Now you can use any pencil, and mechanical pencils are sometimes preferred. Most comic artists do sketches with an H or an HB, or even just a regular number 2, which are the harder graphite, meaning lighter marks. However, you can also play around with darker pencils, going into the 6, 7, and 8Bs, which are a much softer graphite, therefore making much darker marks. Colored pencils are also something to play with. You can get a starter kit of colored pencils from the dollar store, But if you're wanting solid blending quality, you'll want to go specifically to an art store. Prismacolor is an incredible brand with tons of colors and are much easier to blend. There are also water-soluble pencils, which react similar to watercolor. You can make marks and blend them out with water. A good eraser is also an important tool in your kit. A good vinyl eraser, particularly a white one, is much better and much gentler on your paper than the traditional pink erasers at the end of regular pencils. You can also get kneadable erasers, wherein you can shape them in a particular way in order to erase in small or hard-to-reach areas. I've found personally that these don't always work the best, but it depends on what you're working on. It's also fun to try to experiment with different types of paint. Many traditional comics colorists use transparent layers of watercolors or inks over top of the inked pages. Martin dyes are most known for DC Comics, for instance, which are powdered and then mixed by the artists themselves. You don't have to do this when you're starting out. In fact, you can get a cheap set of watercolor paints or gouache at any craft store, and they'll work perfectly well. Markers are also a great way to add color to your comics. And yes, Crayola is perfectly acceptable. However, like with colored pencils, if you want the ability to easily blend your colors, go with more expensive markers like Posca. This is an investment you have to decide you want to make. I always suggest trying out the cheap materials first to see what you like working with, and then making the investment once you've decided. On a personal level, I only work in black and white now, so investing in quality black liners and dip pens and India ink is the most important to me. I did mention dip pens, and this is a more old school way of doing things than the newer black ink liners. I do prefer the Faber-Castell brand because they have a variety of pen tips. However, again, they do get a bit expensive. Getting a dip pen will allow you to play around with line thickness, spatters, and can be used really nicely in gesture drawings. Ink is another personal preference. India ink, for instance, is black ink made from carbon. It's super traditional, and there are plenty of brands in different price ranges, but it's all up to you and what you prefer. We're going to start with the basics of inking using line art. Generally speaking, your comic is going to start with line art. Artists will sometimes only use line art and only rely on this technique to define their works. Typically, you'll see lots of color brought in after this step, and it's usually used in cartoon characters. If you're using inking lines to develop a form, hatching is the first step. It will outline the form of an object and start to suggest shadow. The lines themselves can vary in thickness to show the form's intensity of shadows or shading. So, for instance, something that is more covered will have more tightly aligned hatching. Use this technique within reason because too much will make your subject look busy. This type of hatching can be done with a pen or a dip pen or quill. We also have cross hatching. Having hatching come in at different angles will continue to build up or show changes in shadowed surfaces. Just note that unless your subject has straight and hard lines, doing right angle cross hatching will make round surfaces appear too boxy. Cross hatching will help us further show gradation in tone and shadow. Feathering is similar to cross hatching. usually done with a brush or quill pen because you're able to better control the stroke of the line. From thick to thin or thin to thick, you can control the pressure and control your lines. It's similar to cross-hatching in that it helps us render our outlines and suggest shadows. A graphic style involves fully filling in the shadowed spaces to create a sense of dimension. It does use a minimal use of line to establish form, like we would do with hatching or cross-hatching. I prefer this style, but it's also tricky to do in a traditional way because you're relying heavily on positive and negative space. And we know that adding white lines on top of black is hard to do without the aid of computer software. This is a piece I did based on Jeremy Brett's Sherlock Holmes. It's using a graphic style with positive and negative space, in addition to hatching and cross-hatching, so it's giving a sense of extra depth. I just mentioned positive and negative space. Positive and negative space refers to the subject of the work or area of interest, which is the positive space, and the space surrounding it, the negative space. Generally speaking, your negative space will be the air or sky, or amorphous shapes around your main focal point. This can be played with to achieve different effects, like the image on screen. Is it a vase or is it faces? Usually our eyes go towards the positive, meaning the faces, but it's important to think that your drawing has both and therefore needs to be balanced. We're now going to focus on some gesture drawings as an exercise. The best time to do these is when you have a live model, but having an image will work just as well. The point is to study human form and anatomy and see how things are connected and move. Contractions, joints, twists, curves, and pulls. It's going to be short and it's going to make you think quickly and logically. So, if you're looking at an arm, maybe it's just as simple as a line with a ball for a joint. Is the arm foreshortened? Is it facing directly at me? What is the contour of the arm? You don't have to be a good artist to do this. It's more so that you focus on playing with your drawing and drawing the lines you're seeing. I want you to loosen up on how you're approaching drawing bodies. I've included an example on screen from artist Devin Larson. He's only capturing the essence of his figures, the essence of the lines. 1 minute to draw is not a lot of time, so simplicity is the goal. I'm going to flash an image on the screen, and I want you to draw as much as you can see within that 1 minute. We're going to do this exercise 5 times. Think about what you're seeing. Where are the lines pointing? What are the shapes? And you can push harder to indicate shadow. On the 6th pose, I'll give you 5 minutes. With this final attempt, try to use some of the techniques that I mentioned before. Where are the shadows? And what's the best way to depict them? Are you using cross-hatching? Feathering? Focus on the lines, not the shapes in gesture drawing. As soon as the next slide comes up, you'll have 1 minute to draw what you see. I'll let you know when you have 30 seconds, then count down from 10. I'll then give 10 seconds for you to shake out your hand and get ready for the next slide. We'll then finish with that final drawing, 5 minutes for that one. And I want you to test out the shading techniques. Again, these are sketches. They don't have to be perfect, so use this as a meditative practice and let loose. There are 6 pages in your workbook dedicated to this exercise, so please follow along. Your first minute starts now. Think about the lines you're creating. We're at the 30-second mark. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Take 10 seconds and we'll move on. Your second minute starts now. This is a seated pose. Remember to consider how lines are foreshortened as they point towards us. Thirty seconds. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Take 10 seconds to shake your hand out. Your third pose starts now. This is a more dynamic pose. Where would the hard lines be in this pose? Thirty seconds. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Take 10 seconds to shake your hand out. This is our fourth pose. Remember, fat bodies have more curves to them. Try to indicate that in your gestures. Thirty seconds. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Take 10 seconds to shake your hand out. This is our final short pose, and you can see how dynamic the pose is. Try to capture those lines as best you can. 30 seconds. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Shake your hand out and we'll go to the long pose. We'll begin our long pose now. This will be our 5-minute pose. I'll let you know when you have 1 minute left, then 30 seconds, then count down from 10. Think about proportions. Start with where her ribs are in relation to her pelvis. Construct tubes for her arms and legs. Find those gesture lines, the sweeping curves from back leg to arm draped over the head. When you found the basics, try out a shading style. We can see that part of her body is in shadow. The light is coming from the left side, so the right is cast in shadow. You can see how this shadow falls on her body, how it rounds across her belly and the curves of the top of her thigh. Remember, this doesn't need to be perfect, it's just to play around with new techniques. 30 seconds. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Congratulations, you've come to the end of our gesture drawing exercise. Now that you're warmed up, I want you to start playing around with your character design. While I've only included one page in your workbook to start this development, I would highly recommend you get more paper or a sketchbook to do multiples of this character. These are known as splash sheets. Drawing is fundamentally practice-based, in that the more you do, the better you'll get. Do basic line work to begin with. Start really sketchy and do it multiple times. In only doing this multiple times do we get better. You can always use a piece of vellum paper over top of a sketch that you'd like to copy and use it in your final work. You can also trace over the sketch with ink and erase the underlines once the ink is dry. Once you've finished playing with your character design, it's time to start thinking about adding text. You can use things like narrative boxes. Generally speaking, if there's any narration, it won't be in a speech bubble. Typically, it'll be boxed in by a cell or existing in the negative space around your character. This is also a great place to start playing around with the text itself. This is an example from Shrink. What does it do when I have the text about Twiggy as skinny as Twiggy is? It's only going to underscore the idea that's inherent in the narrative itself. We are a society obsessed with just how thin we can get. Speech bubbles are also a common element in comics. The one on the screen is more traditional. You'll either see it as a circle or a square with rounded edges. And the tip, or the tail, will always be pointing to the speaker. These are specifically speech bubbles, but there are others to use depending on the type of action that's happening in your sequence. This is another example, called the burst balloon. These are used for shouting or an alarm, or speech that really requires extra emphasis. If you combine these with a larger and bolder text, along with exclamation points, you'll find it creates a sense of auditory volume. This one is a thought bubble. They're usually cloud-shaped, generally alluding to a personal thought a character has. It's supposed to be insight provided to the reader that no one else in the comic can hear. The text in thought bubbles are typically italicized. This is a whisper bubble. It's usually a speech bubble using dashed lines to delineate the opposite of a burst. Quiet, hushed tones in a lowercase font does the trick to add an emphasis of quiet speaking. And this is a weak bubble. It's a visual metaphor for showing dialogue that is the result of the speaker being injured or ill. We can also use captions in our comics. Captions, which can be in text boxes or just an open air between or in panels, is your narrative text. This can be third or first person, or the dialogue that's spoken by a character that isn't present in the cell. You would indicate that using quotation marks. It's good practice to make sure your reader can clearly read your text. Think about how it's going to show up when it's printed on paper. Is the lettering clear, or too small? These are things to consider. Keep the dialogue centered as much as possible, and make sure that the order of the balloons or captions is in the order that the characters speak. In Canada, we read left to right and top to bottom. It's bad practice to cross your speech bubbles' tails, so rearrange your word bubbles accordingly. Tails should also point to the character that is speaking, as much as possible to their head where their mouth is. This is a great infographic from Nate Picos on crossing balloon tails, so have a look at Blambot if you want to keep it handy. You should also consider the point of view at this point. Is it the narrator's point of view? Yours? Is it your character's? All of these things are going to be completely unique to you and your story. We'll now talk a bit about arranging your cell compositions. Comics divide up narratives into panels or cells in order to delineate the passage of time. We as artists then organize things within those spaces to create compositions. This would include things like characters performing actions, settings, and objects the characters are interacting with. The overall page also becomes a composition. Traditionally, you'll see the square or circular cell. Think of Peanuts or Calvin and Hobbes. Sometimes artists will use circular frames. Think of Family Circus. These cells or panels are then arranged on a page in a way that's sequential, meaning that the action that's occurring within them will continue the story. Many artists stick to simplicity and stay within frames that are generally consistent in their size. However, playing around with the size of cells and how they're laid out can create different reactions. It can slow the pacing of the story or quicken it. It can create a sense of movement and dynamism in action sequences. Or sometimes it can make us as the reader do a full stop. Comics share a lot in common with moving images in film. Repetition, pacing, and narrative. And all of these elements we can use in combination to create really impactful stories. As an artist, you can use cells in a really interesting way. In fact, sometimes comics artists use the space outside the cells, the unframed space, for particular reasons. Sometimes it's purely aesthetic, and sometimes we do it to drive the narrative in a particular direction. In these cases, typically the space feels as if it's confined to the space around the character or thing, so the mind of the reader invents what's happening around them. This makes comics interactive in a way you might engage with a live theater performance. You know that there are particular confines in which the narrative is taking place, but you suspend disbelief and make a tacit agreement with the art form that you as the observer or reader will fill in the blanks where those limits have failed. We can also use the space around the cells, which are generally known as gutters, or more theoretically known as intericonic spaces, to further our stories. Gutters play a really crucial role in guiding how we, as readers, actually read across the page at a particular pace. They can also give our eyes a break to allow for better comprehension. The size of the gutters can influence the flow of the narrative and help to place emphasis on particularly significant moments. For instance, wider gutters are used to indicate a pause or shift in time, while narrow ones force the eye to go faster across the picture plane. Don't discount these spaces because skillful use of gutters can really add another layer of effective storytelling to your comic. This is from Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. We can see that by changing the size of the cells and adding frequent gutter space, the action moves more quickly. We'll now get into how to structure a composition inside of your cell. We have what are called the elements of design. These include things like line, shape, color, texture, space, form, and value. For simplicity's sake, we're going to focus on the three that are most integral to comics. The first is line. Line is the very basic foundation which defines our shapes and forms. You'll have noticed that when you did your gesture drawings. Shapes are 2D closed spaces defined by lines, so these would include your circles and squares. Your form is the three-dimensional representation of shape, which adds a sense of depth. So when we did our gesture drawing exercises, we started with lines and shapes and ended in our long gesture by using shading to create a sense of form. Another important aspect is space, which is the area around, between, or within your components that defines their relationships. I'd like to speak more specifically about balance within space. Generally speaking, you want your drawing to feel like it's not uneven, and this is a muscle that has to be worked. Weight of a drawing should feel as if it's evenly distributed across the cell, meaning not heavier on one side or another, and this will appeal to your reader much more. Obviously, once you understand these rules, you can go ahead and break them for the purposes of driving a narrative in a particular direction and making your reader feel discomfort on purpose. This is a very basic breakdown from Anton Gorlin for photography, but it applies to comics too. As readers, we want to see balanced compositions, and as each cell is a composition unto itself, it's also part of a larger composition, which is the full page. So trying to keep a balance across all of these components is important. You also need to think about how your page is going to be broken up. Aesthetically, we enjoy seeing layouts that are visually balanced and appealing. Breaking up your cells into even squares is a good place to start for a beginner. If you have a piece of A4 8.5 by 11 paper, you might break it into thirds, quarters, or have a split frame to start off with. Again, this is the simplest way to begin to construct a comic, and once you understand how your action can fit into that format, you can also start bending the rules. It's also important to consider your horizon line within your cell compositions. How is the reader looking at this frame? Where is the edge of the earth when we look out towards the horizon? It's still there even when we're inside, so it shows up as a floor line. We usually start off with a midpoint horizon line. It's really simplistic, but will get really boring from an image perspective. It breaks your image in half and not in a great way. But if you drop it or make it higher, this will offer the reader a signifier to work from. If a house is lower on the horizon line, it will appear bigger and therefore more grand and regal as we're sort of looking up at it. It's still balanced without being cookie cutter, which is interesting and appealing to your reader. A low horizon line can give us the feeling of looking up at things. The example on the left is from Amazing Spider-Man number 520, and it gives us a perspective from below the character, making him appear more heroic and strong. A tilted horizon line can also give us a sense of feeling dynamic tension, which can create unease or fear. We're looking up at the character where we, as readers, are put in a vulnerable position. A high horizon line helps us see something that happens as a vista shot. It's great for creating a sense of the scene that's happening around the action. Think of a character riding off into the sunset. No horizon line, or one that's way out of frame, forces a sense of movement in a particular way. Any of the onomatopoeias are examples of this, like kabooms or kapows, smoke or rocket exhaust. Even working in 2 dimensions, we can create a sense of depth within our compositions. We should also consider scale in our compositions. Scale is the relative size of an object in relation to others in our composition. It gives us a sense of distance and 3 dimensions. Overlapping objects can help too. One-point perspective with overlapping can create interesting 3D scenes that seem to recede into the background of the picture plane. Same with creating layers. Maybe characters closer to us are more in shadow, the foreground, then the midground are a bit lighter, then the background are much lighter. You can create a sense of depth by overlapping these scaled objects or characters, but also by using shadow. Linear perspective will help to force the eye to accept that objects recede into the background. We also must consider our focal point. A focal point is essentially a target that's slapped on whatever thing is going on in your panel that you want your reader to focus on. Sometimes that thing is a character, or sometimes it's an action, but it should be the thing that contributes to the development of your storyline the most in that moment. You can use visual and narrative tricks to force your viewer's eye. Look at this panel from Hellboy. Where's the focal point? As a whole page, our eye is most likely going to be drawn to the watch first, since it's the only gold in the composition. But generally speaking, in each panel, Mignola and his team chose areas to highlight with red as the focal points to drive the story. Sometimes the focal point is more subtle, and artists will employ directional lines to point towards it. These are literal lines that direct towards the character or action focal point. They can be literal lines or curved and organic that wrap around the focal point to force your eye towards it. We can also use values in the same way. Our eyes typically go towards the things with the highest contrast in values, like black and white. You'll more likely see the white first versus the shaded tones. We can use stark black and white as our focal point, with background elements more shaded, as they're less important. Caravaggio's Calling of St. Matthew combines both. The lighting itself was used to point directly at Matthew, and Jesus' outstretched hand is also pointing directly at him. It forces our eye to follow the directional line to interpret the story. There are other elements that can create visual impact, like silhouette. Silhouettes are a great way to play around with not only adding a more varied interpretation to your character, but also to add layers of meaning. It's really helpful because it can indicate whether a character is strong enough in their design to be able to be identified by their basic shape. Even as an exercise, it can help you refine your characters. For instance, Batman and Catwoman's silhouettes are instantly recognizable, and it gives us a real sense of setting. It's nighttime in Gotham City, and both are off doing their superhero or supervillain actions. Much like horizon line, the point of view is something that is important to consider. It's sometimes helpful to think of yourself as the camera person filming the action in front of you. Are you doing close-ups? Are you far away? Are you close into your character's face? Shooting from below? From above? These will all have an impact on how you're telling the story. This is a great page from Becca Hilburn because she uses multiple angles to give us a sense of her character's actions. Foreshortening makes it seem like the character is above us, the hero pose, which can also delineate arrogance. A high view, looking up, gives us a sense of heroism, but a low view can make a character seem small or weak. In Becca's version, looking down at her character in the bathtub puts her in a vulnerable position. Eye level cells give us sort of establishing or informational panels. It's flat, but it gives us the information needed to process what's happening next. Close-ups can help us establish a sense of scale, a view coming directly from an object, for instance. Bird's eye view is looking directly down, but it can show us whatever action the character is doing directly in front of them. In the final part of this module, we'll talk about character poses and how they can affect storytelling. Choosing a pose for a character can make your story or narrative much stronger, less flat, and can make it more accessible. Remember we started to practice drawing our characters? Here's where it's going to get interesting. To start with, you can use a character's pose to express an emotion. Having a character posed in a particular way, in addition to their facial expressions, can highlight these specific emotions. Doing this will ask our reader to connect with the characters on a more significant way. This is a panel from The Incredible Hulk. Despite being a hugely strong character, from his position he looks dejected and unhappy. That, coupled with the text itself, makes us feel alongside him in his plight. We can also convey a sense of action through our characters' poses. Superhero comics do this insanely well. In addition to using space effectively alongside their gutters, they're able to take us through fast-paced action sequences and have us actually believe them. This makes our stories more visually engaging. This image is a solid example from Jim Steranko. We can see the speed at which the action is moving through the images and short gutter spaces, coupled with the use of onomatopoeia throughout. Posing your characters in certain ways also creates a sense of visual flow, and that's not just in action sequences. Even standing still, your character should be acting in ways that continue your storyline. Showing character traits that you've already written and keeping consistent with those traits will help add dynamism to your characters. Think about your favorite superhero. We can recognize them right away based on not only their costume, but their demeanor. Poses can do the same thing. Think of Disney's interpretation of Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. He's a depressed donkey and is always depicted with his head and ears hanging low and a sad expression on his face. By posing him in this way, we get more of an understanding of him as a character, and this is consistent throughout the stories. Lastly, Posing your characters in certain ways can denote their relationships to one another. If two characters are a couple, for instance, they may be closer together when talking or holding hands when they're walking. If they're enemies, they'll likely be further apart in a stance that suggests being grounded in their beliefs. This helps tell the reader that they're on opposing sides. All that said, if you're posing your characters in yourselves in a way that's dynamic and interesting and related to your overall theme, it's going to do a great job of enhancing your overall composition. This will inevitably make the storytelling experience all that more vivid and engaging for your reader. We're down to our final module exercise. I want you to put it all together. I'd like you to finalize a one-page comic based on the experience you identified in the first module, using the knowledge that you've developed in narrative and the skills you've tried out in modules 3 and 4. When you're finished, have someone have a look at it. Does it make sense? Do your characters stay consistent? Is your style consistent? Does the narrative follow a short arc? Hopefully, you'll keep practicing and keep making comics. You might even consider working comics into your own medical practice in whatever capacity you can. You can even use them as a meditative tool to write down your own experiences as you go through them. That said, we're at the end of our time together. I hope you enjoyed these modules and had some time to play with comics on your own. If you'd like to get in touch to talk further, please refer to my contact information on the first slide. Otherwise, thanks for coming and learning with me. I'm your host, Dr. Rachel Thomas, signing off.